we have, it's a little bit, not different presentation. It's different because Jim Adamski is doing it. No, Jim is starting off the presentation, kind of talking about how filtering syrup works and how that goes. And then afterwards, because every company has a little different take on their filter presses and how they work a little bit, we've kind of given opportunity here for others to pipe in. So as soon as Jim is done with his presentation, Joel from Leader Evaporator will be coming in via Zoom as well, and talking about Leader's clear filter press. And then after that, Tim Sterninsky from the Maple Dude will be talking about Dominion and Grimm's filter press, and his is a pre-recorded thing. And then finally, Pete Roth will be live here talking a little bit more about CDLs, filter presses, and things like that. So without further ado, we'll go on with Jim Adamski. Jim Adamski is a fourth-generation sugar maker and has been a maple syrup producer for the last 33 years. The family sugar bush started in the backyard with 25 taps near the city of Anago in north central Wisconsin. The sugar bush that started with 25 taps has grown to over 10,000 taps. Jim has been in the forefront of new technology in the maple world and has employed vacuum, tubing, and reverse osmosis equipment in the family sugar bush for more than 20 years. In 2013, Jim was hired by CDL Wisconsin, Roth Sugar Bush, as a sales consultant for the Midwest. Jim is a past president of the Wisconsin Maple Syrup Producers Association and is the current delegate for Wisconsin to the North American Maple Syrup Council, where he serves as a member of the Strategic Planning Committee. All right, Jim, it's your turn.
Okay, can you folks hear me? Okay, well, hopefully you guys can hear me and everything's going all right. So we're going to talk a little bit about maple syrup filtration. We're going to start out with, how sugar sand or where sugar sand and niter comes from, and kind of the processes in which we eliminate it from our maple syrup. So when we look in that bucket of sap in the spring of the year and we see that nice crystal clear liquid, we often wonder, where is this sugar sand and niter coming from, and then why is my syrup getting cloudy and when I process it? So the cloudy appearance or sediment that we sometimes see in our maple syrup is known as sugar sand. Sugar sand and niter can take on many, many different appearances. So what is actually sugar sand or niter? It is calcium. It is magnesium salts of maltic acid. So these salts start to form during the evaporation process. So the minute that we start to condense maple sap with heat, this calcium and these salts cannot stay in suspension and they settle out of the liquid. So what happens as the more that we boil or the more that we process the sap using heat, the more noticeable these salts are, and we start to see that cloudy type appearance in our maple syrup. So one thing to keep in mind, even if we do filter our maple syrup, if we reheat maple syrup over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, we can regenerate that sugar sand or niter again. So we can take that nice crystal clear filtered maple syrup and we can actually create that sugar sand or niter if we pass over that 200 degree mark. So it's really critical to watch some of our processing and bottling temperatures. So what does sugar sand or niter look like? So it's going to look very similar to what we see in these bottles, and it will take on several different appearances. We have some pictures coming up in some of the slides that'll show some different variations of it. But this is really kind of common to what we see for sugar sand that is in our maple syrup. Sometimes it'll settle to the bottom of your container. It'll look like a layer of dirt. Sometimes it can be a very dark sediment. Sometimes it can be very thick. If we tip the bottle or turn the bottle, sometimes it will adhere or stick right to the bottom of our bottle. Sometimes the sugar sand will stay in suspension, and it will give our syrup kind of a hazy or cloudy appearance. You'll notice in this bottle, we see a little bit of layer on the bottom, but the syrup above it is not necessarily clear. It still has that haze to it, and we want that syrup to become that crystal clear finish so that we have a nice appearance in our bottle. This one here is a little hard to tell, but sometimes it can take on a really dark color, and it'll look like almost a oily substance kind of suspended in the maple syrup, and you'll look like it's kind of floating around or coagulating around inside of that bottle. So the thing to remember is, in a lot of cases, that sugar sand will take on several different appearances. One of the other common things that we see is it'll be a very fine, very grainy substance in the bottom of a bottle. It'll almost take on the resemblance of a beach sand and be very gritty, very granular in nature. So really, why do we filter? This is really the end product that we're looking for. We're looking for that nice crystal clear bottle of maple syrup. And when we start to talk about filtration, a few years ago, the IMSI, which is the International Maple Syrup Institute, set up some clear definitions for maple syrup. Not only did they set the definitions for maple syrup, they also set the new color grading scale and flavor grading scale that we're using today. So when we look at, the definition of maple syrup as it was set out by the IMSI, a few things in their descriptions really kind of come to mind. The taste, of course, should be, normally associated to the color class that it's graded in. It should be free of objectionable odors and or off flavors. And the one we're really going to talk about mostly today is we should be free of turbidity or sediment, which is our sugar sand or niter. So in their definitions, they're calling out that we have this material really removed from our maple syrup prior to marketing. So when we look at taste and flavor of maple syrup, if the sugar sand remains in our maple syrup, that sugar sand and niter can cause off flavors in our syrup. And these flavors can range from a multitude of different, multitude of different flavors, such as a burnt flavor that you can pick up in that maple syrup, a scorched flavor. We can even pick up some of the bitterness maybe that we taste in our syrup, or even perhaps, a hint of buddiness on some of the late season syrup. And a lot of that flavor, is in that sugar sand. And if we can remove that sugar sand from that maple syrup, we can remove, not all the time and not all of them, but we can remove a fair bit of the, objectionable flavors. The other thing that we look at is if maple syrup has the sugar sand in it, the syrup may have a gritty texture when it's consumed. So when you actually taste a sample of that syrup, it may leave kind of a gritty, sandy flavor on the palate, for lack of better terminology. So, let's say it is really important that we get that filtered out of our syrup, because it will, let's say, transfer a little bit of off flavor to it, may give it a little bit of a gritty texture. Syrup color can also be affected by not filtering. So, when we look at the samples from left to right, you'll notice the concentration of sugar sand. The more concentrated sugar sand we see in the sample or container, the darker the sample gets. And this is really noticeable in some of our syrups. There are certain years in the production cycle, in the production cycle that we see that have a real heavy sugar sand that is very dark in color. The syrup coming off the evaporator may look almost, like a dark sample of maple syrup. Once we get the sugar sand filtered out of that material, it may lighten up to an amber color. Just depends on the year and the color of the sugar sand that is in that particular syrup. So when we talk about methods of filtration, there's a lot of different ways that we can filter maple syrup. One of the old methods that was set forth years ago was to let the syrup sit for a prolonged period of time. And as that sugar sand settles out of that maple syrup, pour off the top or the syrup that did not have the sugar sand in, and package that particular product. Unfortunately, we all work way too hard to make maple syrup, and it is a tremendous amount of work. So we don't want to waste any syrup if we don't have to. So we're going to look at different ways of filtering that out. One of the things that you see pop up on the internet once in a while, because of course everything out there is true on the internet, we see the use of cream and egg whites and milk and some of these kind of different food concoctions to coagulate that sugar sand out of your maple syrup. We kind of shy away from recommending that people use this. 1 in 8 people do have food allergies, and we want to make sure that we keep any sources of other food contamination out of our maple syrup in case someone does have a food allergy. So when we look at our more common methods of filtration, we really look at filter bags as kind of the lead in or the entry level. These are used by a lot of hobbyists and some mid-sized producers to eliminate that sugar sand and or niter from your maple syrup. One tool that has came into play here over the last couple years is a vacuum filter, and we'll discuss that in just a little more detail on the upcoming slides. And then of course our filter press. So we have 3 really different methods that we're going to kind of explore and talk about here in some detail. So when we look at filter bags are a fairly common device. They are usually made of Orlon. They sit on a small filler or a small holder, as you see in the picture here. So the thing with filter bags, we can also use a flat filter, which is just a different version of that filter. One of the unique things with the flat filters is we have a tremendous amount of surface area because it is spread out over the top of a screen. So we can filter quite a bit of material through that flat filter versus the filter bag. Both of them are made out of an Orlon type material. So very similar material, very similar construction. So when we talk about filter bags, it's kind of referred to as gravity filtering. Bags are made out of different materials, wool, Orlon, or felt. Orlon probably today is our most common filtering medium that we're using today. They can be used with a pre-filter to increase the performance. So they make a pre-filter that slides down inside of these bags that can also be used in conjunction with the bag, and that will hold a large amount of sugar sand prior to getting into the filter bag to increase its longevity. New filter bags should always be washed prior to using. Okay, we want to make sure that anything that was happened in the manufacturing process, we want to make sure that is washed prior to being used. Filter bags should also be dampened before they're used with water, and we want to wash our filter bag with hot water or just hot water, no bleach, no soap. Maple syrup is very, very good at picking up any flavors or odors it comes in contact with. So a great story that maybe some of you have probably heard me use before is Mountain Fresh Tide laundry soap tastes about the same as it smells. I had went to a family sugar house, and being an equipment salesperson, naturally I always have to taste test everybody's syrup that's out there. So I got a sample of syrup from them. And the first thing you do typically when you're going to taste a sample of syrup is you smell it. And I'm like, it had a kind of a unique fresh scent to it. And I'm like, well, I'm not really sure what that is. So I took a taste of that particular syrup, and you could taste the soap in the syrup. And I asked the man and the woman exactly, what is your process? What are you doing with your filter bags to clean them? Well, we just take that filter bag and we throw it in the wash machine without any soap when we're done using it, and then we just run it through a water wash that way, and then we remove it from the wash machine and air dry it. Well, there was enough soap residue left in that washing machine that we pick up that soap flavor in that filter bag. So like I say, hot water only, no bleach or soap. So if your filter is stiff when it is dry, you know, it was probably not clean when it is what was put away, and it should be replaced. You know, that filter should be soft, and it should be easily, you know, it should be very flexible. You know, it shouldn't be stiff. Thread bearing bags should be replaced. You know, give, like I mentioned before, give your bag, you know, the sniff test. You know, make sure that you know, you don't have any objectionable odors in that filter bag. You know, whatever you pour through that filter bag, whatever smell it has, you know, if it was put away wet and it has a little bit of a musty smell, or if it was put in a sugar house that didn't have the, you know, stored in a sugar house that didn't have the greatest ventilation, and it's got that musty smell to it, you know, that smell and that odor can transfer right into your maple syrup. So just kind of keep that in mind. Like I say, filter bags should be completely dry before they are stored. Like I say, we want to make sure that we don't, you know, come up with any odors or grow any mold in that filter bag by putting it away a little bit damp. So we're going to talk a little bit about vacuum filters. Vacuum filters have came into the market here over just the last few years. When we look at vacuum filters, the reason that this was really developed is we wanted an option to have better performance than an Orlon bag, and we wanted a price point that was not really as expensive as a filter press, something that was kind of in the middle of the road that would do a very good job of filtering syrup. So when we look at the vacuum filter, how we supply vacuum to the vacuum filter is with the fitting that is located on there, we supply vacuum from a shop vac, and we should get a new, clean, dedicated shop vac for this. Please remember that we are making food. We don't want to use a shop vac that we cleaned the garage with last week. Okay, so buy a small shop vac, keep it dedicated for use with your vacuum filter. Like I said, the vacuum will be supplied to the chamber from this port here. You will have to put yourself on a fitting that will match your shop vac hose, depending on what size shop vac you end up purchasing. The filter goes on top of the vacuum filter, and this uses an Orlon filter disc, and it can use a pre-filter with it as well. So it is a very similar material that we're using with the, with the Orlon filter bag or the flat filter, and the pre-filter material is relatively similar to the pre-filters that we're using with the flat filter and the Orlon filter as well. So the syrup is poured into the top of the filter. Okay, the container on top will hold the batch of syrup that we're going to filter through the filters. We have a dial thermometer down in the liquid end of the vacuum filter that is used really to monitor the syrup temperature if we are going to bottle the syrup that we just filtered. The vacuum filter can also be placed on a stove or a small gas burner to maintain that bottling temperature. This is kind of one of the unique features of this, that we could keep that syrup at the proper temperature with the filtering device, so that we could ensure that we were putting our syrup into the container at the proper temperatures for good bottling practices. And this particular filter can be used with or without DE powder, or the diatomaceous powder, which is commonly known as filter aid. So what DE powder is DE powder is a naturally occurring product that is mined. It consists of fossilized remains of diatoms. Diatomaceous earth is nothing new. It was really kind of discovered in the mid-1800s. Diatomaceous earth is used in a variety of manufacturing processes, both industrial and for food. It is used as a processing aid. So in the maple syrup world, like I say, DE is classified as a processing aid. It is mixed in with the maple syrup, and the filters, and we're going to kind of jump ahead here, either the filters that are used in a vacuum filter or the filter papers that are used in a filter press remove that DE powder or that filter aid as the syrup passes through it. So basically the syrup will pass through the filters, the filter aid material will not pass through. So when we mix DE powder into our maple syrup, we will require some agitation. DE powder really will not stay in suspension in our maple syrup. So like I say, it is going to require some agitation or some stirring in our reheat container before we put it into our vacuum filter or before we put it into our filter press. So when we look at the DE, the sugar sand and niter actually start to bond with that DE. That DE then layers across the top of our pre-filter and filters, and it actually helps increase our surface area for filtration so that we don't create that shiny surface that we won't have any liquid go through. We can get that sugar sand and niter to flow through that layer of DE powder. And as we filter more DE powder out of the syrup, that layer kind of grows, and that by that layer growing, it just keeps increasing that filter capacity until our filter is full. So that's really kind of the purpose of DE powder, and we'll talk about that a little more with the filter presses. But like I say, with the vacuum filter, we can use the DE powder with it or without it. If you have some syrup that is kind of stubborn and you filtered it through either an Orlon bag or through the vacuum filter, and I can't quite get it as clear as I want. If you have the vacuum filter, then you have the option, like I say, to run that DE powder with it. When you're using the filter bags, you really don't have that option. So that's something that's, like say, just came along in the last couple of years. It's kind of fairly new to the industry over the last 4 or 5 years. The next thing we're going to talk about is filter presses. So when we talk about filter presses, there are several presses out in the market, and we're going to grab the concepts off this one, and all the different manufacturers on the round table will have their chance to kind of talk about it a little bit more in detail. We're just going to go through the basics of how the filter presses work. So when we look at a filter press, pretty much all of our manufacturers are going to look very similar to this. So when we have the incoming syrup, it's going to go in on the suction side of the pump. That's where our syrup and DE mixture will enter our filter press. And when we talk about pumps, we can have electric diaphragm pump, gear pump, air diaphragm pump, several different pumps, hand diaphragm pumps, and those will get talked about here in a little more detail later in the presentation with the round table. But basically, on the suction side of that pump is where our syrup and DE are going to enter our pump. And then at this port over here, the syrup will enter our filter press. Okay, very simple and straightforward on the start of it. So filter presses, the primary components of the filtration part of the filter press are really broke down into 3 parts. On the far left, we have what's called a waffle plate. Okay, the center picture is our filter paper, which goes between each plate and frame in our filter press. This material is actually preventing the DE powder from going into our maple syrup. As the filtration process goes forward, the syrup and DE come in contact with this paper. The DE will not go through the paper, the syrup will, and that's what really creates that final finishing. That's the portion where we remove that processing aid from our maple syrup. And then the last component is our hollow frame, which we will talk about here shortly and how it works. So those are the 3 primary components of that filter press. So when we look at an assembled filter press, you're going to see in the picture that between every frame and every plate, we have that paper on an assembled filter press. And that is really what we're looking at, as far as what a completed filter press looks like when it's ready to go into operation. So when we look at the filter press, the first thing we're going to look at is kind of our waffle plate, and we're going to get a little tutorial of what's going on internally inside of that filter press. So on this particular syrup, or on this particular filter press, excuse me, the clean syrup exits the press on the holes that you can see on the bottom on the lower left-hand side. So that's going to be the clean side of our filter press. So where I had mentioned in the first slide where this is where the syrup enters our filter press, the dirty syrup enters the filter press on the right-hand side, and it's going to flow down those tubes. So as we put our filter press together, all of these holes line up across the bottom, and that's how our syrup flows down the filter press. So what happens internally inside of the filter press? So we have our clean syrup side of our filter press. We have the dirty syrup side of our filter press. Once the syrup is coming down the dirty side of our filter press and it enters the first frame or this hollow cavity, there is a small hole, and it's kind of hard to see. I'll tell you what I'll do here. We'll kind of point it out. Right here in the casting, we will have the hole that is basically machined from our dirty syrup inlet into the inside of our hollow frame. So our syrup passes through that channel into this hollow frame. Inside of this hollow frame is a large, wide open area, and this is where we accumulate our DE powder and our sugar sand and or niter that we filter out of our maple syrup. So what happens during the filtering process is we begin to fill up this cavity with liquid and filter aid, and as the press continues to run, these cavities get more material in them, and eventually they should get full and make a solid cake if you're operating your filter press correctly and using the correct amount of DE powder. So when a filter press is started, we should recirculate that syrup and that DE mixture through the filter press. And what that's going to do is that's going to charge or coat all the papers in the filter press with a layer of DE powder. And as all of these plates or all of these papers have the coating of DE across the surface, we will see the discharge hose on our filter press. The discharge of our syrup will go from a cloudy material, and it should go out crystal clear. In a lot of cases, what we do is we just take the discharge hose where our clean syrup is going to be coming off of our filter press, and we route that right back into the pan that's heating the syrup or our draw-off tank or whatever the case may be. But once that press is loaded with that DE powder and we have it layered across the papers, we should see that syrup go from that kind of that cloudy, murky material, possibly even a little darker material, and it should, like say, it should run crystal clear after just a short period of time. And then once we have that press loaded, then we're ready to fill a bottle or we're ready to fill a barrel, whatever the case may be. So when we look at a filter press, this is an example of the inside of the hollow plate once the filter press has been opened up for cleaning. So this is the cake that comes out of that hollow plate in between the papers. Now this particular cake is a pretty good looking cake. We'd like to see, when we take our press apart, we like to see a nice solid cake like this. That is really kind of the key. So if we say, for example, we're operating our filter press, a lot of our filter presses have a pressure gauge on, and we can operate them up, between 70 and 80 pounds before we need to shut them off. When we open up our filter press, we should see a nice solid cake like this. If we're not seeing a nice solid cake like this, odds are we did not use enough filter aid or DE powder in the process, okay? Kind of something to keep in mind, as the season goes on, typically that early season syrup filters very easily. As season goes on, typically syrup gets just a little bit harder to filter. And as the season goes on, as that syrup gets harder to filter, the proper step to take is to use more DE powder. So the harder the syrup filters, the more DE powder that needs to be used. And like I say, when we take that press open, we should see that nice solid cake. So say, for example, I take that press open, or I open up that press and I go to take the papers off the sides of the hollow plate, and the syrup and everything just runs out of there, and I have just a small film or a small layer on my paper, it'll be really easy to see that I did not use enough filter aid, with that particular batch of syrup. So when we talk about, like, say, Filterator or DE powder, it is considered a processing aid for the filtration process. So if you're a certified organic syrup producer, don't be afraid. You can use filter aid just like the standard producers are. If you are going to use filter aid as an organic producer, you cannot call your product 100% organic. You can call it organic, but we cannot use that 100% organic label if we are using the filter aid, but we still can have it as organic. So once the syrup passes into the hollow plate and it is layered up with the DE powder and it starts to travel out our papers, those papers are pressing up against this waffle plate, okay? And this is really what keeps the papers from just blowing right straight apart. That paper is sandwiched in between the waffle plate and the hollow plate. And this is where our syrup is actually coming back through the paper, and it's going to travel into the clean side of our filter press. So when we look at a close-up photo of the filter press plate or the waffle plate, on the clean side syrup discharge, you will see there is a series of small holes that are milled into here that travel through this aluminum or through the steel into the clean syrup channel. So if we back this up just a slide, it's hard to see, but those are, on this particular photo, those slots or channels are located right down here. So the syrup flows through that grid or that waffling on its way down to the discharge point. Like I say, it's going to travel through here into the clean side of our filter press. So that's really what's happening on the internals of that filter press. Once it passes into the clean channel or the clean side of that filter press, it's going to go out the discharge hose, into your bottle or into your barrel, whatever the case may be. So a few things about filter presses, tips and tricks and different things. We want to make sure that we're always using a food grade DE powder. Okay, we see a lot of times in the maple industry, corners like to get cut once in a while, and all of a sudden, hey, I can pick up this swimming pool DE powder for $15 a bag less than the food grade. Well, there is a reason it is food grade DE powder, and we want to make sure that you are using a food grade DE powder. So stay away from the swimming pool DE and some of the other stuff that you might find out there. We want to make sure we keep our syrup temperature, fairly warm. A good shooting point is, try to get it through that press at 180 degrees. The nice hot syrup going through that press definitely does help the situation. One thing to remember is we do want to stay below 200 degrees. So say, for example, if I'm pumping syrup through a filter press and I'm filling bulk barrels off my evaporator, and I've got my draw off set at 219 degrees, and I'm going directly through my filter press and right into my barrel, and my press is staying hot because I have a great flow of syrup coming off the evaporator. We really want to make sure that stays below 200 degrees, because if that syrup going into that drum is over 200, we can develop that sugar sand or niter once it's through the filter and in the drum. So it is, like say, it is very critical that we try to keep that below that 200 degrees, so that even after we get that sugar sand and niter filtered out of that maple syrup, it does not redevelop by having the temperature of that syrup too high. Like I had mentioned before, we want to make sure that we charge the filter press with DE powder until that syrup runs clear. We want to make sure that before we start filling a bottler or the filler or whatever the case may be, we want to make sure that syrup is nice and crystal clear when it comes out of there. Most filter presses have a diverter valve that will allow the operator to route some syrup back to the tank if the pressure is getting too high. And that really is only going to be on a pump that does not have a variable speed. So that would be, your gear pump, your electric diaphragm pump. What you can do with the use of that diverter valve is, if you have a 6-speed pump and your pressure is getting too high, you can have another hose attached right to this fitting here, and you can route that back into your tank to relieve some of that pressure, so you can get a little more capacity through your filter press. The other thing with this diverter valve that you can do is you can turn this handle into the up position. And what that'll do is that'll allow you to use the filter press pump as a transfer pump. So with the valve in this position, we can go through the filter press, turning the valve to the other position. We can run syrup out this discharge fitting. So we can use that pump on that filter press to transfer syrup out of a barrel into a reheat pan, or out of a small container, into a reheat pan. We can use that same pump that's powering our filter press. We can use that to move or transfer syrup around in the sugar house. So it's kind of a nice feature to have on that filter press. A few other little things with filter presses. So if you're running a longer bank filter press, say for example, so say you have a seven bank filter press, and you are filtering maple syrup and you're getting right down to the tail end, your pressure is coming up on your filter press, you're approaching 70, 80 pounds, you're starting to see that syrup weep out between the plates a lot more than normal, and it's starting to leak, and you have just a small amount of syrup left to finish, and you shut the press off and you're like, jeepers, I really don't want to clean that entire filter press because I only have a gallon or two left to finish or to filter. What you can do is you can go through and you can take your filter press half apart, say for example, and you can clean out 2 or 3 of your hollow plates, and then you can put the papers back in, reassemble that filter press, mix some DE into the remaining syrup that needs to be filtered, recharge that filter press, okay, with the 2 or 3 hollow cavities that you just cleaned, route that syrup right back into the tank, until it runs clear, until we get that good coating of DE powder back over the filter papers. And then once the syrup is running clear, then you can go back into your bottler or back into your barrel, whatever the case may be. Like I say, there's a lot of times where we end up with a plugged filter press and we have just a small amount of syrup left to filter, and that's a great way to kind of cheat the system to finish up that batch without having to clean that whole press. So like I had mentioned before, if the syrup is filtering hard, increase the amount of DE powder that is being used. Unfortunately, during this presentation, I cannot tell you exactly how much DE you're going to need in a batch of syrup. If I could do that, I think I would be doing something else. But you'll have to just look at it. And a great telltale sign is when you crack open that filter press, you want to see that nice solid cake. Okay. One other thing with filter presses, as a filter press is being used, they will get dirty. And I'm going to just jump back here a couple of slides. Watch these holes in these filter presses, and pretty much all of our manufacturers' waffle plates are really kind of built the same. If we have, and I'll give you a great example, our sugar house, for whatever reason, we are blessed with probably more sugar sand or niter than I've ever seen in my entire life. So we see some plugging actually once in a while of some niter and sugar sand in these particular ports here. We see that quite often. And jumping back a couple more slides yet, and this is, and you can see just a little bit of residue right here around this edge. We see some plugging with sugar sand or niter on these ports. So say, for example, if you take your filter press apart and just say, for example, gosh, I took my whole press apart and my pressure was up to 80 PSI or 90 PSI. And the whole filter press, the cakes are all nice and solid, but I open this one up and there isn't a thing in it. Well, check your inlet hole, make sure, like I say, that we haven't plugged that up with sugar sand or niter. And then as far as overall performance goes, like I say, watch these holes here, make sure we're keeping all these ports clear here as well. With that being said, that's about all I have in the presentation as far as the presses go. I will see if I can figure out how to get this baby opened up here to answer any questions. Maybe Teresa can chime in here as well if she is around.
Am I ready to go? Okay, Jim, I have one question for you. Can you bring that over?
Okay.
You mentioned the powder
on my, yep.
As a filter aid. Do you have
Yes.
to declare that on an ingredient statement if you use a filter press?
The answer to that is no. So Even for organic certification, it is used as a filter aid, or a processing aid. It is not considered an ingredient, so you do not need to list that on an ingredient statement.
Am I ready? Jim, I have another question. What is better, an electric diaphragm pump or an air diaphragm pump?
Well, it all depends on, so there's several different things there. So we look at a electric diaphragm pump that is going to run at a fixed speed, okay? So as the pressure builds in your filter press, if you want to bleed off some of that, that pressure, you would open up that hand valve and route that bypass line back to tank to take that filter press up just a little bit higher in pressure, or shut it off, like say when you reach that 80 psi. It all depends on your budget. You know, the air-driven diaphragm pumps are a very nice pump. They are relatively expensive. We've had one in our filter presses at our sugar house. We got a couple presses. We've had the air diaphragm pumps for years. They are an excellent pump. You can vary the speed on them. So to give you an example, we have a little larger evaporator, and we have a pretty steady stream of maple syrup coming off that evaporator. So we'll just crack open our air inlet off our air compressor to our filter press pump, and it'll just slowly pump. And that slow pump will keep right up to our evaporator. It'll keep our filter press nice and hot, which definitely does, you know, increase our filtering performance. And, you know, let's say it is a very simple pump to operate, maintain, you know, just basically flush with some good hot water at the end of the day. If I had my choice, the air diaphragm pump is definitely the best, but sometimes, you know, everybody has a budget that they need to function within. So.
Does the DE clog both pre-filter and Orlan?
In the use of a vacuum filter, it will layer over the top of the pre-filter before it is impregnated into the Orlan. I hope that answers the question that he's asking. Just read them off there.
You talked about the signs for when there is not enough DE. What are the signs that you are using too much DE?
Oh, that is a great question. So when you look at, you know, it's a fine line between performance and so when you crack that open, you want to see it requires just a little further analysis on that cake. So if you're using too much DE, when you take the papers off that hollow frame, that cake will be solid as a rock. I mean, it'll be just, I mean, you'll barely be able to push it out of the plate. So when you push that cake out of that plate, it should be solid, semi-solid, not runny. But if it's hard like a stone, and when you push it out of there, it kind of crumbles and breaks apart. You can really tell then you're really using too much DE powder at that stage of the game. Like I say, it'll kind of, instead of coming out in a nice solid chunk, it'll kind of crumble and flake apart. You'll be able to tell the difference. So.
Okay. Do you use a cone filter when the syrup comes off of your evaporator pan before it goes to the finisher?
It will definitely take a lot of that sugar sand or niter out prior to going in there. I mean, we'll still have to do the final finishing, but you know, using that pre-filter and doing a quick filter off the evaporator, it does take a lot of that larger material out and does stretch out your filtering capacity on the tail end when we do get to that finished syrup coming off that filter. So it is a good idea. It will work. It will improve your filtering capacity on the tail end. You know, like say you're either going to take it out a little bit coming off the evaporator, or you're going to have to take everything out when it comes off as finished syrup. If we can get some of that out ahead of time, it's definitely going to help on the finishing end when we're finishing that filtered, you know, that final filtered syrup. So.
What advice do you have for dealing with slimy or stringy syrup?
Stop cooking when it goes bad.
Sometimes it seems like adding more filter aid makes the problem worse.
So if you're getting stringy or ropey syrup, your sap has spoiled. Okay, at that stage of the game. So I don't care what type of filter you're trying to use. When you get to that tail end of season, and that syrup is either getting stringy or ropey because the microbial contamination of our sap has elevated so high that we're making that crummy syrup. There is really no way to filter that ropiness out of that syrup or that stringiness. So you need to stop boiling when the sap is starting to go bad. So
Another question. You mentioned the powder as a filter aid. Do you have to declare? Oh, we did this one already. Sorry.
Yep.
I only tap about 100 trees and produce around 30 gallons of finished syrup. I usually end up filtering 2 to 3 times through Orlon bags. When should a producer switch to a filter press? I can get it pretty clear, but sometimes I still got some niter.
Okay, so I mean, when we look at the different levels of syrup filtering, of course, our entry level is going to be either our flat filter or our Orlon filter. It's going to do an okay job. Our vacuum filter is kind of our next step. It does give us some increased capacity. It does give us the opportunity to use a little DE powder in there that will give our syrup that better finish. I mean, truly, at the end of the day, if you want consistent, crystal clear, nice looking bottles of syrup, really the filter press is your best option. And there's several models available. I mean, they start with just 2 or 3 hollow plates and a hand diaphragm pump to hand filter syrup, or an electric gear pump or an electric diaphragm, and you can kind of work your way up as you go. But really the Cadillac for filtering, if you want a consistent, sparkling, clean bottle of syrup, a filter press is really your best answer. So
I know you kind of answered this question before, but I don't know if someone missed the answer to this, so it's kind of duplicate, but if you could answer it again. Is there such a thing as using too much DE?
but yeah, like I said, we have mentioned this before. So if you're using too much DE, when you take your papers off your hollow plate, that thing will be hard like a rock. And when you go to push it out of that hollow plate, it'll kind of want to crumble and break apart. It'll almost, to add a little more, comments onto that, it may almost, you might notice almost a little whiteness to it. You won't see that nice dark discoloration. You might see some more white on the surface. So like I say, when it comes apart, it's going to come apart really hard. It's going to be extremely dry and very crumbly. And that's usually a good indication that you got just a little too much DE in there.
Well, thank you, Jim. We're going to ask you to hang out for a little bit in case we get some more questions at the end. Next, we've got Joel from Leader Evaporator. He is going to come in via Zoom as well. Joel is a maple syrup producer from Merrill, Wisconsin, and the Midwest sales rep for Leader Evaporator. And I believe his territory has been expanded a little bit, but Joel will hook you in, and Jim, hang on. And when we get through the rest of these, we'll have time for more questions for everyone. Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear and see me? I think I've got everything turned on properly.
Can we hear you? We can hear you, Joel.
Okay, good. I'm going to start out by showing a short YouTube video. So I'm going to share my screen and show a short YouTube video introducing a new size of filter press that Leader Evaporator brought to the market. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about all of our filter press offerings and go from there. So
hi, this is Kevin Lawyer at Leader Evaporator, highlighting our new hand pump filter press. This features 3 polycarbonate frames, this hand pump, and a stainless steel body. This will be available this spring for order, along with the rest of our presses. Please contact our dealer network or check us out online. Take care.
Okay.
Hi, this is Kevin Lawyer at Leader Evaporator, highlighting our new hand pump filter press. This features 3 polycarbonate frames. This hand pump and
I apologize for that. The YouTube autoplay got me. So that was Kevin introducing our new hand pump filter press. It's a 3-frame filter press made with the polycarbonate frames. It's rated to filter 10 to 15 gallons of syrup in one batch of filtering, but obviously that depends on how easy your syrup is filtering that day. It has got the same hand pump that has been used for a long time in the industry on the hand pump filter press, and it has the same polycarbonate frames and same stainless steel mesh plates that we've used in our clear filter press line for the last 8 or so years that we've had those filter presses available. It's been working really good for everybody who has it, and if you're interested in taking a look at one of them, contact your nearest Leader Evaporator dealer. We have a couple throughout the state. They're listed in our catalog. We have Pittman's in the Durand area. We have Eli Hosteller in the Cashton area. We have Mike Orson up in Prentice, and then we have Nick and Daryl Schulist, and they are near Wittenberg. So contact one of them if you're interested in something like that, or contact myself. Many of you have my contact information already. Other than the hand pump filter press, we also offer a full line of those clear filter presses from the 5, 10, and 15 frame filter presses. The 5-frame filter press will filter approximately 40 gallons, and the 15 frame filter press filters in that 120 to 150 gallon range easily in one filtering. So that's our full line of the clear presses available. We have them in a air diaphragm pump and a electric motor driven gear pump option available. So we have pretty much the full gamut of the filter presses covered. With the gear pumps, we are, of course, now using the non-lead brass gear pumps since the 2019 model year of the filter presses. Other than the clear filter presses, we also have some aluminum options available. We have partnered with H2O to market a select number of their products. So we have their aluminum 10-inch and 20-inch filter presses available that you can also get through your nearest Leader Evaporator dealer. The 10-inch is something that is kind of the next step up from the smaller clear presses, and then 20 inches obviously for a very large commercial producer. The biggest 20-inch filter press, we're seeing more than 10 barrels of filtering capacity in one shot. So those are something for definitely the commercial producers out there. So we definitely have options to fit everybody's size and availability or what they need. If you don't have electricity available or anything like that, we can make things work. We also, of course, have flat filtering tanks and cone filtering tanks available for purchase also, and all the supplies that a person would need to get that thing going. Again, if you have any questions about any of the offerings that Leader Evaporator has, please contact myself or one of the Leader Evaporator dealers throughout the state. I guess if anybody has any questions right away, you can ask them in the chat. Otherwise, if you think of something, I'm sure we can come back later also. Actually, I do see a question that must have got asked. If you don't mind, Jim, I'll go ahead and answer this one. Somebody asked about rinsing syrup out of the filter press. So you can rinse syrup out of a filter press and flush the filter press to get that remaining syrup out of the DE, but you have to use water or something to chase that, so you won't have finished syrup coming out. A lot of times people use hot sap out of the flue pan to chase out their filter press. But you have to remember that will have to get boiled down again. So that last final filtering of the year, you're probably not going to be able to get all of the syrup out of that niter DE cake. So that's the answer to that question. If anybody has any other questions, like I said, or you think of anything, you can either ask them now or later, or get a hold of me or one of the Leader Evaporator dealers. That is all I have, Teresa. So whoever is next can take her from here.
Thank you, Joel. I'd ask that you stay on as well, and you and Jim can answer some questions maybe at the end that come up as well. Next, we have a little video from Tim Sterninsky. He's a Dominion and Grimm dealer. He is a maple producer from Granton, Wisconsin, and owner of the Maple Dude. So we'll play his video next, and then we will move on to Pete Roth, who will be here live. And when we get all done, there'll be time for everyone to ask questions of anything they've come up with. Thank you.
Hey, everybody out there in Wisconsin Maple Syrup Producers Association land. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to do a little video where I talk about filter presses, their function, and some tips. So please stay tuned. All right, guys, let's get right into this. I had to film this today because I was not able to go virtual, but hopefully I give you some good information about filter presses, their function, their use, and some tips. Now, first of all, what I want to say is if you're watching this and you're still wondering about a filter press, obviously you're a hobbyist, and that's okay. The vast majority of people who make maple syrup in Wisconsin are hobbyists, and I was there once just like you guys were. I was literally cooking over an open pan until I got this whole setup that I have up here. And it was relatively over the last short period of time of a few years. But with that said, I can tell you this, the filter press was easily the most influential purchase that I've ever made in my operation. It just took lots of headaches out of the whole process. You don't have to mess around with those Orlon bags and pre-filters, which honestly are just a big headache as the syrup just cools down and refuses to flow through them. The filter press is going to solve those problems and give you crystal clear maple syrup one time through. Now, let's talk a little bit about the filter presses themselves. If you're a hobbyist and you want to go with a filter press, there are a few options. This one here is a Dominion & Grimm 7-inch short bank electric filter press. Now this has an electric diaphragm pump on it, which is really nice. DG went to these a few years ago. They were the first one to do this kind of on these entry-level models. The other companies were still putting out units with the electric motor, pulleys, belt, and gear pump. And to me, let's just leave that on other pieces of equipment like air compressors. This is nice, it's simple, and it works well. Here, let me flip it on. It's pretty quiet. So, you've got your nice stainless steel piping back here. You've got your electric diaphragm pump. You've got a couple of valves on here. You can actually use this and bypass the press itself or the bank of plates itself, and you can use this as a transfer pump, which is a nice feature to have. You can transfer liquid syrup from one container to another. But if you use it as a press, this one has 3 of the hollow plates. This is where all your settlings and your DE gets caught up in here, and the reason I like these is they are thicker than most of the other makes that I've seen out there. This hollow plate is quite a bit thicker, so that means more capacity for filtering than the other small filter presses out there. You're gonna put a paper filter between each one of these plates, and then you mix the DE or diatomaceous earth in with your hot syrup, and you will filter it through this press. Just turn on your pump and really put your draw hose into your hot syrup and turn it on, and out the outlet hose comes your filtered crystal clear maple syrup. You know, there's really not much to this. You can't do a lot wrong except possibly put these plates in backwards, but there are markers on here to show you which way they should line up. Right here, you can see those on this side. Something like this comes with, if you buy it from me at my shop, it comes with the hose to get you started. It comes with a bag of the 50-pound bag of the DE. That's what you need to mix into the syrup as a filtering agent. And also, let me grab this. It comes with a box of the 7-inch filter papers. So that's kind of a brief, quick rundown on that filter press. Okay, over here, guys, as another option is the same exact filter press, but this one has an air diaphragm pump on it. Now this is an air pump that you run with an air compressor. Now, the main advantage with this over the electric pump is you can control the air pressure to it, so you can control the flow of the syrup through the pump. When you are running these, you're going to want to run until you get about 50 PSI, around there. You can kind of get a feel for it after you get more comfortable with it. But once you get the pressure up to around 50 PSI or a little more, you know that these hollow plates are getting full or your paper filters are getting clogged. So with the air pump, you can kind of control your pressure a bit more, control your flow a bit more, rather than with the electric pump, it's all on or all off, and all the pressure of the electric pump is on those filter papers at one time. And of course, like I said, with the air pump, you can control that more and there's less pressure all at once. But if I'm being honest with you, if you're a small hobbyist and you're literally thinking about taking the move from going to the Orlon bag filters to a filter press, the electric pump is going to work good for you. It's going to work good. If you want to spend more money and make your gallons of syrup that you make more expensive, the air pump is also a good option. We've talked a little bit about these filter presses. Let's talk about some tips for filtering your syrup and how these things function. Like I mentioned before, these are the filter papers that go between the plates. This is for the 7-inch press. It's really super easy. You just put them in there, and then of course you're going to put one between each plate like this, and you just simply tighten down these handles, and that's how that's held in there. This is your diatomaceous earth, DE, or filter aid, some like to call it. And you can see that it's just a white powder, and that is actually pulverized fossils. And so it's nothing that can hurt the syrup. It's not a chemical. Sometimes you'll have people ask that if, you know, it changes the flavor. No, it does not. All that stuff, including the settlings and things in your syrup that you're trying to filter out to get clear, are going to be in these hollow plates between those pieces of paper. So you don't have to worry about that. It's not adding anything to your syrup. It's not changing the flavor. It's not doing anything like that. So rest assured, no problems there. The other thing you want to do is get your syrup up to 180 to 190 degrees from where you're filtering it from and into your bottler or whatever. You got to have it hot to go through these presses. So other than that, guys, I would say that about covers it. Again, if you have any questions personally or want to talk to me about it, I'll put my number in this video. I'll put my email in this video. Otherwise, you can find me online, and you can find me on all the social media pages such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel where we do have videos talking about maple syrup production, demonstration videos on how to make maple cream, maple sugar, things like that. Just message me there. Any one of those, I'm really reactive and proactive, and I'll get right back to you. Definitely recommend one of these if you're willing or looking to simplify your operation. This is the way to go. It's a lot easier if you're wanting to take that next step. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you found that information useful and informative. Now have a great 2021 Wisconsin Maple Syrup Producers Association Winter Institute Virtual Convention. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you soon. And remember, always keep it real.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Next, we'll ask Pete Roth to come up and share what else hasn't been shared yet, I guess. Pete Roth's from Cadott, Wisconsin, and of course owns CDL Wisconsin and Roth Sugar Bush. Here he is.
Hello, everybody out there in virtual world. I guess I'm struggling for what to tell you here. It's kind of been covered by the three guys before me. The things I see in there and see for problems is the first problem is DE filter. The filter powder, be sure it's food grade, be sure it's made for the maple world. If you have a filter press that doesn't work and they bring it in, 99% of the time, it's the filter aid. They're buying something from a pool filter, or you can buy filter aid from ag supply stores. It's cheaper, but it's not a food grade product, and it's not ground the same. It's not made for our industry. They use filter aids in many industries, and it's just not made for what we do. In the questions too up there, somebody wrote that they asked how to filter stringy syrup. Stringy syrup shouldn't be filtered. It should be sold as bear bait. Once it's become stringy, it's no longer good for our industry. It's either old sap or too late in the year, or something's happened with it. You don't want to be filtering, stringy or ropey syrup. There's a lot of definitions there of the same stuff. You'll see that. Other things in there that hasn't been covered, I don't believe, was what can go wrong while you're filtering. You can start the filter press up. You can be running it. It's fine. As it builds pressure, all of a sudden it becomes cloudy. You've tore a paper. You've run your pressure too high. Over time, if guys bang around their waffle plates, they'll get a sharp edge on a waffle, and it'll tear your paper. So what I like to do is I start my filter press, and whatever I'm drawing it out of, I run it through the filter press right back to that. And while I'm doing that, it's warming my press up, and I can take a sample bottle and I can look through it and see if it's shiny and how it should look. If it looks good, then I stop the press and I transfer the hose to whatever you're going to, a barrel or a bottling machine. Because if you do it straight from there to the bottling machine and you don't have a paper correct, then you got to clean the bottling machine too. If you run it back to where you got it, at least all you got to clean is the filter. It'll save you a step. So there's little tricks like that. I like to lay a towel over my filter press. One, it holds the heat in better. And two, if you run your pressure too high, and it'll leak between the plates, it never sprays into the pan. It always sprays on the ceiling or on you or somewhere. So that'll trap that and let it drip down. So I just take a towel and lay over it. It contains it if you do spring it, get a leak from having it loose or too high of pressure, stuff like that. If you guys want to send in questions too, go ahead, and I'll try to answer them here as Teresa gives them to me and that.
What maintenance is there on an air diaphragm pump?
On an air diaphragm pump, there's very little maintenance. You can give it a drop of food grade oil once in a great while. The biggest thing is when you're done with it, to pump some hot water through it so their syrup isn't sitting in your diaphragms, because the next time you go to use it, the shaft that transfers back and forth will be stuck in one position or the other, because that syrup will get on it and won't let it slide. But just flush some hot water through it when you're done for the day, and it'll be fine. We used to replace gear pumps every month, and now we can go 5, 6, 7 years on an air diaphragm pump before it needs to be rebuilt. You got any more?
Just a comment, so if you can repeat it. It should be mentioned that some filter press pads have holes that must be installed correctly. Take care in time when setting up the press.
Yeah, can they see the questions? The question our comment was to be sure every filter paper has specific holes for that machine. A lot of them are close and match, but when you're putting your press together, make sure the holes are lined up with the holes in the press. Because if your hole's off, it'll kind of circumvent the system too. And how a filter press operates, you'll see all those plates. Some got 10 plates, some got 3 plates. The syrup doesn't travel through every plate. It only goes through one plate. It comes down the tube. It comes into the frame, we call it, the hollow plate, and it goes through the paper, out the waffle, out the discharge channel. So it isn't filtered multiple times. It's only filtered through one paper. So if you're taking a temperature reading in the center plate, you're only getting the temperature of the syrup in that plate. The syrup temperature on the end plate or the beginning plate is different than the center plate. So if you're going to take a temperature reading, take it on the product coming out of the press, not just in one plate of the press.
What are the telltale signs that you burst the paper?
What's the telltale sign you burst the paper? With the gear pumps, you can hear the speed of the gear pump change. It'll be laboring and all of a sudden it's running free. That's a good sign that you did something. The air diaphragm will speed up. The sure telltale sign is when you look at your sample, pull a sample quick and it's real cloudy, it's passing filter aid through the paper somewhere. It's got a tear in it, something happened to it. We're good there? Yeah, well, there is a pressure gauge on them. Steve reminded me. Generally, after a year or two, somebody breaks it off and just puts a plug in the hole. But it's there's a pressure gauge. Recommended pressure is usually 50 or 60 pounds, depending on the press. You can keep the gauge on there. That's a good telltale sign. But once you use the press enough, the sound will tell you more than anything. How that pump's running, how it's going. With an air diaphragm pump, you can set a regulator feeding it air. And whatever you set it at, say you set the regulator at 60 PSI, that pump will stall at that temperature or at that pressure. So when it hits 60 pounds of pressure, you don't have any more force to push any more syrup through. So I'm not very good at this virtual stuff here. So
If you run too high of a pressure, can you blow up a machine? Can you ruin a motor? What can happen?
question was, if you run too high a pressure, can you blow up a machine? I've never heard or seen one ever blow up. It'll spray syrup out between the plates, and lots and lots of guys that went and got a pipe and put it on that crank and put more force on it. If you're blowing paper or syrup out between the plates, clean your press. A lot of times when you clean a press, there'll be a little bit of sugar on a plate. Well, that leaves a little void there. So just make sure your press is real clean when you put it together is the biggest thing to come, so.
You ready?
Sure.
Can you get too big of a filter press? I have a continuous flow flat pan and draw off through 1 bags into 5-gallon buckets and store until I have a few batches to bottle. Then I would have to reheat to 190 degrees and pump through press to bottling can.
The question was, can you get too big a press? Yeah, you can get too big a press because you got to charge that press with filter aid. You've got to, you can have too many papers to change, not enough syrup to heat the press. So most presses are expandable. So if you start with a smaller one and your operation grows, you can expand it, and presses are really sought after. So if you outgrow the press larger than you can expand it, trading it or selling it and upgrading is real easy to do. Everybody's looking for a filter press. We good? You got one more, you said? No, we're good. There you go. I'm out.
Thank you, Pete. Maybe if there's anything else that the other presenters, Jim or Joel, Jim or Joel, do you have anything you want to add before we kind of hang up here? Just unmute yourself and go ahead and talk. If not, we'll move on to something new.
One quick thing. Somebody had asked about maintenance on air diaphragm pumps. The pump itself does not have any maintenance to it except for keeping it clean. But one thing to be cautious of, especially with air diaphragm pump filter presses, if you're a producer that's doing bourbon barrel aged syrup, make sure you're straining that syrup before it makes it to your filter press after you dump it out of the bourbon barrel. That syrup will have a bunch of charcoal in it from the inside of the barrel. When you dump that out, anything that's much more than about an 1/8 inch can get clogged in that pump. There's a stainless steel rod that slides back and forth inside there, and then some check balls. And I've seen presses that have been brought in, people complaining the press isn't working. We take the pump apart and it's chock full of charcoal. So that's one thing to be very cautious of, is big pieces of that charcoal from doing your bourbon syrup can get caught on the internals of that pump and cause that pump to not work. It can jam that slide up or just not allow anything to flow in there. So just be cautious. Just a simple stainless steel kitchen screen works really well after you pour that barrel out to just kind of try and get all that charcoal off the top. It all floats, so it's easy to get off. But that's something you want to be cautious of if you're doing that when you're refiltering that syrup, because you can make a mess out of your pump. You won't ruin the pump, but you got to take it all apart to clean it out, and it's probably a lower project, if not more.